So welcome to the node.js package maintenance team meeting for June 21st, 2022. We'll follow our standard agenda, which was in issue number 530. Before we get started, does anybody have any announcements they'd like to share? Okay, if not, we will move on to the, oops, just a sec, sorry, I pasted things in the wrong places. I just want to move them into the right place, but we'll follow the agenda, which is in that issue. The first thing is session at the Collaborator Summit. Well, the Collaborator Summit is over, so I think we can close that one out.
How'd that go?
It was quite good. I would say, given there were fewer, it wasn't as big a conference, I think, because of, people are still recovering from COVID and being willing to travel. But I think like in the rooms, and Luke can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there was like 40 people or so in terms of the Collaborator Summit sessions, which I thought was quite good. Given we wouldn't have had as many people as we might normally have had. So, and we had some really good discussions on some of the next 10. There was a couple of good deep dives. There was a nice discussion on TypeScript, some of the things and sort of types that we should do. Some good stuff around tooling, related to maybe bringing in some more things into Node.js itself, as well as around like an entry point to let things like observability tools or some other things like serverless be able to make sure they can run some code early in the bootstrap cycle. Luke, was there any other things that you can remember that highlights that I missed there? I'm sure there are a couple.
All the ones that you mentioned, like I was probably the ones that I would have mentioned.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I think that went well. And the other related thing is, we are talking about doing one along with NodeConf.eu probably a few days before the conference and, in Dublin. So for a little bit, it'll be the one that's a little more friendly to people in Europe. So maybe we'll see other people there then. The next one, which is discussion on how to accelerate modernization of the ecosystem. Maybe I suggest we come back to that one at the end. If everybody's okay with that. So then the next one would be 2022 promotion events. I don't know if we have anything too new to talk about on that one. We did the proposal for a session OpenJS World, but didn't happen. I think otherwise there's just some things we want to do, but we just need people who have time to move them forward. So unless anybody has a comment, I might just say no update this week. The next one was status and updates for next steps of PKGS create. I don't know if there's anything on the agenda. We had gotten access for, I think at one point we were blocked on access, but we enabled that, right? So I think, again, that one's just waiting for people with cycles to help actually move it forward. So if not, maybe there's no update on that one. And then there was the suggested list of modules to get support into info. I'm just going to open that up because I know there was some comments from LJ in terms of something in support, and I just want to make sure that we've closed on that discussion. Right. Okay. So basically there was some questions and LJ's added support info for some of his packages, which is great. And I guess I need to do a publish of PKGS support. So I'll take myself a note to do that. Just because we've got some changes that aren't there and that would have answered his questions. Okay, so I think that's, I'll take a note, Michael, to. Okay, so other than the, how to accelerate the modernization of the ecosystem, that was takes us to the end of the agenda. Was there any other agenda items people wanted to bring up for discussion this week? If not, then I think we can probably loop back to 513. Here, I just want to take one note here. Right, so that one, I think, since we've got a bunch of time, maybe we should discuss this one and figure out, what we should do or not do on that one. And does that make sense to people?
Sure.
So I think we did have a discussion last time, and Owen, you added a comment that kind of reflected our conversation on it, right?
Yeah, I'm looking at it now, so that appears to be the case. Forgot about it, but it's a good thing I wrote it down. Yeah, I think I guess for context for anybody new to the issue, if it's worth just grounding, that was well, the original post was promoting or advocating for, I guess, a modernization. Well, define modernization later, but a modernization like audit of, I guess, specifically top packages, influential packages, hot path install packages, whatever, and was evaluating them on like the specific JavaScript features and or node.js APIs, or that was kind of where the conversation was heading. Like, hey, you're still using this and you should be using this, or more so, just this is newer. So there wasn't a whole lot of, and as I think Jordan pointed out, and I think others as well. It looks like Beth was in there. But I think to my latest comment was more or less the takeaway from our last conversation as a team was, maybe, I think we agreed that modern was fairly subjective, but that if you maybe looked at it from the perspective of kind of risk, it could be a little more objective. Sure, fetch is, if in the browser, fetch is fun, but unless someone actually takes away XHR, still use it. You might not be able to do more things than fetch, but if it only does the one thing you need, so anyway, I guess the kind of the takeaway is, what does modern mean? And, should some, is there a criteria that's relevant, maybe at least in the context of this group or just in general? And is there maybe a better metric or indicator of, or I guess ultimately, I think what they were trying to get at and maybe this is where we can open up to conversation, was, maybe more around maintenance per se, I guess. I mean, that's certainly a risk, I suppose, is kind of where it kind of comes back to, is a project that's unmaintained, potentially more risky because certain vulnerabilities and its dependencies haven't been updated. Not that it's using, HTTP versus fetch. But I think it's still worth a conversation here. Maybe in some cases there are APIs that are very, buggy or leaky and, have been superseded. Like, maybe some could make a really great case for not using date, whatever, So anyway, I guess I'll just put a pin in it. And the point was to talk about it, so I should stop.
So I think, like, in the context that you've given, right? Like, if we looked at it as there's a bunch of modules, and like in the context of risk, that could be more objective. I'm just sort of brainstorming. I suspect everybody has something they do when they look at modules and how they choose modules. I know, like, at Red Hat, we have some stuff we've worked on, and I suspect that, maybe Owen, where you work, there's something, and maybe Dominicus. I wonder if, like, trying to set, like, try and getting broader input and say, like, hey, we think, one of these things is, we think this is an interesting topic. Let's get people together to share what they do. And then, based on that, try and come to put together something that we think is a reasonable, superset of that, or even just documenting what different people have said. That just seems like a concrete thing that I personally find interesting to hear what other people do, and maybe it gets us an outcome that is along the lines of what this was getting at. I don't know what people think.
Not to just, totally eliminate kind of like one category of evaluation, but, perhaps, Michael, you might have a really good insight. Are there legitimate cases where an API, either in like node.js or just JavaScript or something, like, is literally like, please, like, from all of us, no one's ever going to fix it. It's a giant security hole. Like,
Buffer.
I don't want to say that there aren't those cases. It just seems like it's harder to quantify them, I suppose.
I think anything that's deprecated is like, it's just waiting for something to be reported against it, and now you're stuck, right?
Yeah, I guess, is that the case with HTTP? That was one of the examples they gave. I guess the HTTP package specifically.
Right.
Like, ranked against things like Bluebird, Request, Express.
Yeah, so some of those are, it's, like Request is one where it probably works, could still work fine, but it is deprecated, and the maintainer has basically said move to something else, right? So that's one of the checks that we use for sure, is to look for things. Doesn't mean that it's like, okay, that's a problem immediately, but there's a number of different things that, you can look at in terms of that kind of risk.
And then what if someone says, well, I can just use overrides to patch the vulnerabilities myself, because I'm using this in like 1,000 places in my app?
I've seen, we've got at least one case where we're working with the team where they've come to the end of that and they're still stuck. Not with Request specifically, but like they basically, like, we can't upgrade for different reasons. We tried tweaking versions and whatever, but no, we can't get rid of related vulnerabilities in the tree and all that kind of stuff. So I think that can get you somewhere, but it's only so far. I mean, it comes down to, I don't think we're ever going to get to a case where it's like, it doesn't make sense to continue using something. Like if it's buried and you're deep in your tree and you're not going to update, you're doing a risk assessment, right?
I mean, like, what are the interesting things from, oh, sorry, hold on. I mean, I think I liked what you were saying earlier about maybe kind of crowdsourcing the valuation strategies, or kind of the signals that other use in terms of, like, if there was, it seems like the most likely course of action, at least within this group, is to at least document, whatever is shared and worth preserving. And yeah, I guess, well, for instance, like the way that, well, I mean, I guess, yeah, ultimately, I guess, does it come down to technology or something else? Like the way that Socket is analyzing dependencies in terms of, like, hey, a post install script was added on a patch release. That seems really, different, or, this. And on top of that, the owner changed since the last release, and, things like that. So, yeah, I
those
feel like
I
maybe
think,
that's a good starting point before we kind of tip the scales on any one particular package or API, perhaps, or at least it seems like there's a lot to mine from that side of the conversation, at least.
yeah, like I think those are like trying to do short-term analytics. You could see similar, like some of the similar kinds of things I think we do is we try and look at like how active has the project been over the last X months, right? And that doesn't mean that it's bad, because it could be perfectly fine if there's no updates, but maybe it's something you should consider, right? And similar, because it's similar, like if the owners changed, that's sort of like, if it changed a year ago, you don't care so much. I'm just thinking like they're maybe like mirrors of each other. One is more like over time, the trend, versus short term. The short term ones are probably more security related versus the, well, it's no longer, if you're going to choose a new package, would you choose it or not? Or would you have concerns over using it? But they are, yeah. But I don't know if anybody has any other ideas like on this one. That was my one idea. Is we could try and hold a session on and share those kinds of things. Like how do people choose their dependencies and what do they look at? And
so there's already deprecation guidelines doc, right? Maybe that needs a review, and maybe that needs publicizing on the blog post, and just generally, defining something as better practices. Then, of course, there's the existing vulnerabilities and potential vulnerabilities. Potential vulnerabilities are only an issue for things that you may consider as unmaintained, and they may or may not happen. So yeah, that's the risk assessment, right? But they don't really hurt anything. There's been some cases in a very recent past, I think in the past few months, where there was an issue in some very old modules who everybody thought was unmaintained and just assumed that it's not going to happen. But the maintainer stepped up and released a patch, and so making all of these assumptions before they happen is a little bit unfair. As well, like in some cases, these modules they are not maintained. Yes, they no longer receive updates. They no longer receive modernization, maybe because they're done, maybe because there's people who like old school JavaScript without promises and consts and lets. Arguably,
yeah, there's nothing wrong with that.
Arguably, they could be more right than us in certain respects. And in some cases, they're just done with it. But that doesn't mean that the module will become vulnerable in the future. So, I mean, that plays a part into your risk assessment, of course. but recommending such a module as this group, or recommending somebody that they don't use a module as this group, I like the question is, are there things that are better? Of course, the core now has things built in, right? There's the CLI parser, there's the, so yeah. So like for these potential things, potentially unmaintained modules, which may potentially not receive security updates, it's hard to judge. We shouldn't. Then there's the deep dependency trees. And this is, I guess, by nature of Node.js, they are deep because we like small modules. And that obviously means that there's potential for one of those to just slip in something that already exists. But when I did my scan, I haven't done the scan recently, but in the top 1000, way back when, so 3 years ago, so maybe it has changed, right? There's obviously new vulnerabilities, although from what I've seen on our internal scans, in the like really popular modules, the top 1000, their NPM audit does not report much on, like if you scan them, if you scan their latest versions. Now, whether people are using these latest versions internally, that's another question. Whether the deep dependency trees are using the latest versions, that's also. But like it was like across all the 1000, there was less than 10 vulnerabilities reported by audit, right? So in terms of, and even then you could, there's always debates like, is this regex DDoS? Does it really matter? Because
right, yeah, for sure.
So maybe there's a bit of a, we want things to be modern and good, and I very much am in agreement with that, and I'm the one trying to push things to get the updates to happen wherever I can in my teams where I'm working. But
maybe instead of modern, it's what's safe to use.
Yeah, so I don't know.
I guess I'm just.
Are they unsafe?
Yeah, that's what I mean. I think what I hear Dominic says is
if they're not reporting vulnerabilities now, and we cannot say that they will have vulnerabilities in the future, and we cannot say that the maintainer will not address those vulnerabilities, then right. There is a problem of the big dependency tree when you have something very deep, which depends on an old module, and because we're using small modules and everything, and the upgrades do not necessarily bubble up. And that is a bigger problem. But then like the best that you can do is if it's a big module, then you need to fork away and maintain it yourself. Right.
I guess what I'm hearing is like, I don't think I think what we're saying, your feeling is like, there's no way we shouldn't be like saying module X or Y is good or bad. And that
we can't, right?
No, right. Like I agree with that. Like it's not for our group to say, this is out of date, this is new, or what.
Like I could say that, but not on YouTube when live,
sure.
Right?
Yeah, like we can have our own opinions and for our own uses and teams, that's fine, right? But like as a community thing, I agree. I don't think it's our place to push for that. We could help people with tools or information that lets them make their own choice. But
yeah, so
not like, that's the question, is that a useful thing to do and try and push on in terms of like, how do we gather that kind of information so people can make their own choice? But I just threw that out as an idea. I'm not even sure if that's.
I'm very much in support of whoever does that commercially. But once again, like as a
right. Okay. So you're like, that's a good commercial product versus a community, like the tooling and so forth. So
yeah. Without the commercial backing, it's hard to support that, right?
Right.
Just being realistic.
Yeah.
But I think that where we could focus on, and I think I said it in the past, is making it easier to fork, making it easier to maintain the forks against the upstream, and like as a holistic approach, right? Making it, once again, as a community effort, maintaining some sort of a list. It could be that it ends up being an extension to augment npm's website if we cannot. But the compatible modules, like there's a fork of request that is being maintained in a way that I believe that comes from Puppeteer. No, not Puppeteer. It's one of those. Cypress. I think Cypress are maintaining their own request fork. And what they're doing is whenever a vulnerability is in request, they're just removing features which they don't need, right? But it is, like some of these features are pretty obscure.
Better than adding more.
Exactly, and I mean it works, and they take away the vulnerabilities. They make the scanners happy, but how do you highlight all of these? How do you bubble up the fact that this fork exists and it's a drop-in fork unless you use a certain, list of features? Maintaining that kind of a library, maintaining a list of easily droppable alternatives. Like if you're switching from request to fetch or from request even to Axios, you need to do work, right? But the Cypress request fork is mostly drop-in. It's the good old request with just some vulnerable paths removed. Please, this is not an endorsement.
Sure.
I haven't looked at the code. I just scanned what it's trying to do, right? May or may not be true. Please correct me somewhere in the comments or in the issue if I'm wrong. But if it were true, that is a good way of doing it, right? In case of request, we know that it's not going to receive patches. In case of some other modules, they may receive fixes in the future when the maintainers, want to go back to maintaining it more full time. And in that case, you do have an issue that, these forks maybe ideally grow back together and, but maintaining all of these distributed forks, I think that's the right approach to addressing this. And in a commercial setting, that's also the approach that you end up having to take is you make an internal fork and you maintain it internally if that's what you have to do, right? Because there isn't really a proper alternative. Trade patch files just like Linux kernel.
So I think that that sounds like an interesting idea, but I don't think it's in this particular issue was hey.
Yeah, it's the opposite. It's not.
It's
not
kind of the
modernized.
opposite. So I'm almost tempted.
That is,
yeah. So I think that would be a separate issue to discuss or pursue if we wanted. But I'm almost tempted on this issue to say, we've talked about this a number of times, but we don't really think it's something that, it's not something we think we're gonna take on as a group or can push forward or, there's too much in terms of that, what's appropriate for a particular situation to be able to make enough of a blanket statement that says don't use this or don't use that we're not going to end up doing that.
I just want to point out, as Dominicus brought it up, if you look at the deprecate guidelines, it's practically written in there's sections that are you as someone looking at a package, how do you see if this thing is still relevant, safe, whatever? And it talks a lot about, forking or, a lot of this stuff is there. So I'm wondering if it's just a matter of saying, hey, this is a good idea. We have documentation already. Do you have some suggestions? Are there tips, tricks, tip the scales types of recommendations? Basically from your point, Michael, hey, what do you use when evaluating a package? If it's not in the document, open a PR or something like that, basically.
Right.
Basically, that's how, any of these situations, we can just keep updating that doc, because it does, it's for package authors to actually deprecate, but a lot more of it is actually kind of more from the consumer perspective. And so maybe just sharing that and just iterating on that with these additional hints, signals, experiences, whatever. without actually calling out any one particular package or whatever. So maybe that's a way to kind of help them engage, or at least kind of, get their thoughts on paper so we can, have like a concrete discussion about these things. Because to Dominic's point, if it's doing what it needs to do now, it's not setting off a bunch of alarm bells. Can't precog what the maintainer is going to do, but for the time and place. So my +1 is to steer the conversation into seeing if we can update or add to that doc, because it seems like it has a lot of what has been brought up in that issue already. So best to build on. It ain't broke.
I see. Right. Okay. So, would you want to comment add a comment then to the issue, and maybe we close it at that point? I'm just trying to think, like, what's our closure on this one? We've had a number of discussions. I think we're sort of at the end of our useful discussion on it.
Yeah, I would say comment and then give them another meeting cycle to see if they reply or have any feedback, and then we could just close it and say, we're closing this issue, but that shouldn't stop you from wanting to contribute or share this document and have other people contribute to it. So I'm happy to comment. I'd say leave it open for another meeting cycle. And, either way, I think part of it is just, we're all kind of reminded that it's there. So if it does come up, hopefully we can be like, oh, right. Yeah, check this out. And, go from there.
Okay.
Again, they might be more on the, they might be specifically calling out things. So, I guess it depends on if they're, I haven't seen them.
I don't think they've commented back
since,
on the,
So I think that'll be good. I think part of it will be just help understand if, where their opinion lies, if they're more into like actually picking winners and losers, or if they're, happy to, go on a less subjective and more objective. But either way, I'll comment and let them know.
okay. And then we'll leave it on the agenda for one more cycle and then go from there.
Yeah, I think that's enough time to give them a chance to keep the conversation going.
Okay, that sounds good. So I think that takes us to the end of the agenda. Is there anything else we should talk about before we close out?
Not from my end.
If not, then we'll talk to everybody later. Thanks.
All righty.